And today we're continuing on with the Hannah story. I think 2 weeks ago I shared about Hannah and how her life was, in the beginning, for a while, it was full with sorrow and mourning, but God intervenes and her mourning turns into dancing and to joy and singing and praise and whatnot. So, and this can be not just a story about Hannah, but it can be a story about our life as well. So I want to share that part of the story today. But before I begin, I want to ask you a question. I want you to try to think about a time, an occasion where you felt as though maybe that may be your life right now, but when like you were being maybe mistreated by someone, or I don't know, misunderstood, ill spoken of, rejected by someone. I mean, we have, from time to time, occasionally we can experience moments like that, and this is what actually Hannah has experienced. And I want to share a story before I read this passage in 1 Samuel. My mom, who's American, my dad is Korean, and we have nieces that live in the near LA in South Orange County, and so every once in a while we'll get a chance to visit my sister's family who live out west, and we'll take the kids to the beach and among other things. My mom, because my sister's kids, they were born and raised in the States, they're somewhat Korean or maybe Korean American, but their Korean language linguistically is sort of, they can manage a little bit of like spoken Korean, but they don't really get to use it that much. And the written Korean is they have a little challenge with it. So my mom, who's American, I don't know if you can imagine this or picture this situation. It's kind of funny because my mom, who's American, she lived most of her life in Korea, so she's pretty, halfway decent in her Korean, but she goes to visit her grandchildren in America, who's clueless about their kind of written Korean. So here's this American grandmother trying to teach their Korean or Korean American grandkids how to write and read Korean. I mean, can you picture this? It's kind of funny. I mean, you have to sort of imagine this. So anyway, we have some teachers in this room. So as teachers or as parents, when you try to teach your students or children, you have to be very imaginative, and you have to try to be as creative as you can, and try to teach them this kind of stuff, whatever you're teaching, right? So my mom, in her own way, she's getting up there in age, but she's trying to, connect, with the kids, with the grandkids, and trying to teach them, and because she wants them to try to learn and at least be able to read some Korean. So in her own way, she was trying to be creative and imaginative. And I don't know if we have a couple of these pictures up here. So what she did was, first of all, she started out by writing, I think, a passage of the Bible. I think it was Galatians something, maybe chapter 3. And she wrote it out in Korean. It's all kind of in Korean. We say 삐뚤 빼뚤. It's not like all correct or grammatically. It's not all perfect or anything like that. But then she tries to be even a little more creative and a little more imaginative, because she wants to teach in a way that would connect with the grandkids. So she would write, like, make it easy and simple. So she would write like a word, like a vocab at a time, on Post-it, little notes. And so she would write one word and stick it on, like one of my niece's name is Isabel, and then she would stick this word on her forehead. And have Lydia, who's her older sister, trying to teach this word, learn the word. Do we have this? Yeah, 여동생. Some of you know this word, which means younger sister. So she was trying to teach Lydia, which is Izzy's older sister. This is the word in Korean, 여동생, which means, literally translated, younger sister. So this is how she would try to connect and communicate and teach Korean vocab to Lydia. And another word, this is kind of gets a little bit funnier or weirder, but more weird. But anyway, the next word, if you could put that up, is there another picture? 다음 사진 보여주세요. Yeah, this is my wife. She's working in the kitchen, cleaning up, doing dishes or whatever. And my mom decides to use this word. Some of you are picking up this word. Some of you can't read Korean. That's okay. I'll translate it for you. It says in Korean, it's literally 죄인. You know what that means, right? Some of you, literally, it means sinner. Okay, a sinner. So she writes this word, saying my wife is a sinner. She knows that. I know that. We all know that, right? We're all sinners, right? Forgiven by God. But anyway, is there another word? She writes another word, I think. I don't know if we have it here. Yeah, this is, she doesn't write this correctly. Her grammar is all messed up. This is me, by the way. And she writes this word trying to teach Lydia Korean. And it's Korean. It's supposed to be just one. There's no k in there. It's supposed to be 엉터리 목사. This is a little harder to translate, and this is my mom's description of me. And basically, the best that I could come up with English translation is no good pastor. Okay, so she writes this note on the post-it note and says, describes her granddaughter Lydia, no good pastor. Anyway, so this is how she tries to teach Korean to her granddaughters. But anyway, we all have these moments in life, whether you're young or old or male, female. Whether you're teacher, student, parent, it doesn't matter. But we have those moments when we're let down, when everything seems to be going south, we're misunderstood, we're disappointed, we're rejected, all of these moments. And Hannah, going back to the story of Hannah in 1 Samuel, she's experiencing this. And so she's just very frustrated, she's very upset, she doesn't know what to do, but she decides to do something that we should do when we encounter these moments of difficulty or pain or frustration or maybe anger. This is something that we can all do. What she decides to do in that moment, people can do all different sorts of stuff. When we're disappointed or upset or frustrated, a lot of people, maybe a lot of adults, they turn to, maybe they go to a bar, hoping that a drink or multiple drinks will solve the situation, or maybe we can forget about this situation, the pain or the problem for a little bit, deal with it later, sort of a thing. Or maybe we jam the music, crank it up, and maybe we let that kind of sink in, and we just try to forget everything, drown everything out. Maybe we try to go on a long walk, maybe we try to go on a long drive, whatever. We all have our own methods and ways to try to forget about the pain or the problem or the sorrows that we are experiencing. But Hannah does something quite remarkable, which is something that we can all do. She turns to God. That's what she decides to do. In her deepest moment of anguish and pain and sorrow, what Hannah chooses to do is she turns to God. And that's when God begins to do this work in her life. And he begins to turn her mourning into dancing. So I want to just read a portion of this passage from 1 Samuel. And I think it's in your program if you picked one of these up as you were walking in. Or if you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And I'm just going to read the first part from verse 12 up to the first part, I think, 18. And I think it's on the screen too, so you could read along if you want, follow along. It says in verse 12, as she continued praying before the Lord, so she decides to seek God in her frustration and anger and disappointment. Eli observed her mouth. But this is interesting because Eli, the priest, again, her situation is difficult enough as is. And yet, Eli, who's sort of like a pastor in today's, age, so somebody like me or Sonny or Larry, Eli misunderstands her best intentions. And she's just there, spilling her gut, just trying to seek God in her situation. And yet Eli misunderstands her motive and intention and everything. So it's kind of sad, In verse 13, it says, Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. But Hannah answered, no, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. And let me just pause right there for a second. I think a lot of times when we pray, I really appreciated that moment of prayer a little bit ago that Larry led for us. And I think a lot of times worship or prayer is about coming before God and stopping, for a little bit even, whether it means silencing our phones or whatever it is, right? Because we're in the business of life. A lot of times during the course of the day, we don't really have that minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes to pause and sort of straighten things out with God, and a lot of times we need that because we're created in His image, and we're designed to see things, see life in perspective. And I think worship and prayer, encourages us, allows us to have those moments. But anyway, so she's trying to pray, and so she's, but my Lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time. Then Eli answered, go in peace. So now he understands. Now he gets it. Now he begins to see a glimpse of her pain and sorrow and disappointment. So he goes, go in peace. The God of Israel, grant the petition you have made to him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your sight. Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. And we're introduced following that, passage in 1 Samuel chapter 2, where she basically, there's this beautiful poetry she writes. It's a prayer, actually. And she's basically announcing how God has changed, her deep sorrow and anguish and misunderstanding and all of this. God has changed it to this moment of gratefulness. And God has, when she was in the past, wasn't able to conceive a child, God spoke to her and God led her in such a way. God answers her prayer, and now she's able to bear a child who's Samuel. And that's the story how of Samuel begins. But anyway, we have moments like that too, don't we? When we're misunderstood. In her case, she was misunderstood and rejected and all of this, and even the priest, Eli, misunderstands her. So her sorrow is deepened in some sense, right? But even still, she continues to seek God in her pain. And I think, sometimes this is what we need to do. Like I said, earlier, some people take their pain and sorrows to other places or other objects or other places, other things, other people, maybe to a psychic or maybe to somebody else or whatever. But Hannah teaches us something, and she shows us something, that in the midst of our trouble and sorrow and pain, what we really need to do, it's good to have people that we can turn to, that we can count on, that we can get counsel from, whether it's the teacher or parents or a friend or a mentor or whoever it might be. But ultimately, Hannah, through her life story, teaches us, shows us that we ultimately need to look to God and reach out to Him rather than turning to other source of remedy. Hannah decides to do something only brave souls can do. She takes her troubles directly to God. She doesn't take it to a norebang. She doesn't take it to a bar. She doesn't take it to a psychic. But she turns to God. She chooses deliberately to do so. And she says, basically, look upon your servant's misery and remember me. Look upon your servant's misery and remember me. Because God is a God who sees. And God is a God who remembers our pain, our sorrows. I may have shared this story before, I don't know, but there was a time when our family was planning on a trip, and all of a sudden my wife says, I can't find 2 of our kids' passports. So and now we have 3 days left. And you can't renew a passport, at least I don't know if you can do that in other countries, but in Korea, generally it takes 2 full weeks to get a new passport. We have to go to the city hall, and so, I try to make several calls, and it was really frustrating because I knew it, we had all this, plane reservations. We're going to have to somehow try to change it, have to pay penalty. I don't know if we're going to really be able to go. All of this, so, we went to this city hall in Tunsan, I think it is, not far from here, and I think I took my wife Jenny went with me, and I have to take proof of at least one of the kids that we actually have a kid. I'm not making this story up, and we really lost this our kid's passport. So I think we took Rachel, our youngest, with us to City Hall, and something happened in that meeting. I mean, I was hoping that it would become, really successful, positive, and where I could convince this guy, this trip is really urgent. We need to make this trip, this journey, and then we need, is there any way you could just do this service kind of thing to work quickly so that rather than taking 2 full weeks, if you could turn it around in like 3 days, I mean, I'd really appreciate it. I would do anything you want, I would buy you a Lamborghini if you want, I'm kidding. But anyway, I was trying to be really convincing and, persuasive and tried my best and all of this. But then, Rachel was in this room and she was only like 5 years old at the time. So, she doesn't really understand all the lingo and all the language and all the nuances and all that. This man, he's Korean. He's like a manager level at the city hall. And he all of a sudden, I think he was trying to be nice or trying to be cool or maybe trying to be funny. All of a sudden, he turns to Rachel and says this in Korean, 너 참 개구쟁이처럼 생겼다? Like this. And basically, 개구쟁이, it's not a bad word. It's not a negative terminology. Rachel didn't really know what that meant literally. Basically, it's like, you seem like a tomboy. This is what this man told Rachel. And I don't know if that's a positive comment or whatever, but maybe Rachel wasn't really happy with the way this man was communicating this message with her. So she decides to say something. I mean, she really came back with something pretty strong. I thought it was pretty funny and pretty cool. But this man, I don't know what he thought, because basically she looks at him straight in the eyes, and in Korean, with a loud voice, she goes, 바보 똥꼬, like this. And in Korean, basically it means you stupid butthole, like this, to this man who's a manager level, at the city hall. And so I thought to myself, that's it with the passport. I mean, we're not going anywhere. This is it. She messed up our trip. But anyway, he was gracious enough to make that passport come through, and so we were able to go on our trip. But you know what? Stuff like this happens in our life constantly, all the time. When stuff, things that we planned doesn't quite go the way we planned it. Everything just kind of starts to go south. It doesn't turn out the way we had expected to. It happens all the time, and people are frustrating us, disappointing us. Sometimes we get wangta, we get rejected. All of this goes on. And in that moment, I just want to ask you, where do you turn to? Who do you turn to? And in this context, there's actually a pretty cool word in the Hebrew language. It's used twice. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 and in 1 Samuel chapter 2. First one appears in chapter 1 verse 10. And the second one appears in chapter 2 verse 9. It's used a little bit differently, but in the context, if you follow carefully, 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2, the first word, the Hebrew word has a word kum in it, kum. It means to stand or to raise up. And it says, if you go back to chapter 1 verse 9, when Hannah was experiencing this trouble, it says that she got up. She literally got up. She got up in the midst of her pain, in the midst of her sorrow, in the midst of her frustration, in the midst of her anger. She decides, she chooses to get up. To do what? To go and pray. In other words, to seek God. And there's this nuance here where the writer, the author, is using the same word, same vocabulary, same root word, kum, in Hebrew. Except in verse 9 of chapter 2, this time the subject is God, where it says, God raises Hannah up. God turns Hannah's mourning into dancing. God begins to do this work of miracle because Hannah got up to seek God in prayer. And God is the one who decides to step in her life and raises her up. And you know what? This is what God does in your life and mine. And another thing is God, this the beauty of the church and the beauty of God's people, the way He designed it is so that God raises us up out of our sorrow and pain and gook and everything else. And He does that so that we can raise other people up who are in pain and sorrow and brokenness. That's what He does through you and through His church. Like helping Emmanuel and their daughter Hope, who can't hear. I know it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money to have that surgery for Hope, who's 6 years old. But many of you gave already. You gave generously. Our other church, Korean-speaking church, Boritdok people, the members of that church gave. The other church, Riverside, they gave. They're still giving. Why? Because the church and God is in the business of raising people up, not because we're great or we have it all together, but through God's grace, we're able to do this. So as you turn and look around and notice people who are desperate, who are in trouble, who are in pain, who are in sorrow, God is calling us because we make up the church. We are His people. And He is inviting us to step in and make a difference. Let's pray together, shall we? As we bow our heads and as we pray, I just want you to, maybe I want to share two thoughts real quick. Maybe I am in that position. Maybe you're in that position where you need to be lifted up. Maybe I don't know what you're going through right now, but maybe you're in that sorrowful situation right now. Maybe no one can understand your pain because you haven't shared it. I don't know. But God knows. He says He knows your name. He said He knows He can count the number of hair on your head. And He even, whatever tears. There's a passage in the Old Testament He says He keeps it, all our tears. God keeps it in a bottle. Imagine that. Every tear you shed, God keeps it in a jar, in a bottle, and He remembers it. Imagine that for a moment. So whatever pain, whatever struggle, whatever trouble, whatever anguish you have that you're going through, whatever suffering, just remember that God knows, that He cares, and He wants you to get up out of your seat and look to Him, turn to Him, and go to Him and seek Him, because He is a merciful God. He's a gracious God. And then just one other thought as we pray. Maybe ask God to give you the eyes, the hearts to see and notice the people around us who may be suffering. Maybe on our campus, maybe within our school, in this church, maybe in your family, and maybe even outside of this country. And God, help us to remember them. And if there's any way that I can share, whether it's materially or my time or whatever I could do to help them, God, please use me. Help me to step in, to lift up their sorrow and pain. And use this church, God. Use CIC and use TCIS. Help us to be a hope-giving community because, God, you're all about hope. So I just want you to pray that prayer right where you are. And we'll close in a moment with another song.